92% of Ukrainians are in favor of Ukraine joining the EU by 2030, which is a huge jump from December 2021, when 67% said they would vote yes in a referendum for immediate accession. There are people working very, very hard in Ukraine and all over Europe to make this happen, and we have 3 of them here with us today to talk about it. I'd like to invite them to the stage now. First, we have Olha Stefanishyna, who is a Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine and responsible for European Union accession. We have Michal, Vice President of the European Parliament. Thank you. Thank you. And we also have Katarína Mathernová, who is Deputy Director General of Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement from the European Commission. Thank you all. And I think I spoke to someone early this morning, and I think that we have 2 women on the stage who probably know more about this topic than almost anybody else in the world. So we're very, very lucky to have them with us. Before we get started with the discussion, I'd like to remind everyone that you can upload questions on Slido. We'll also be taking some audience questions in a moment. I'd like to start with you, Minister Stefanishyna. Ukraine is under heavy attack now for the 3rd day in a row of many, many long days of war. When you talk to Ukrainian citizens who are sitting in their shelters, who are waiting for the air alerts, I think my phone was going off like crazy today with air alerts. Are they thinking about EU accession? What does EU accession mean to them right now, today?
Well, thank you. It's probably a perfect angle of discussing this today, as first and foremost, the responsibility for everything I do, everything we do as a country and a government is the responsibility for our people and the armed forces. And this is the report we hold in front of them. And I can assure you that it is of particular importance, knowing that our armed forces are fighting on a battlefield and our government is running the country in a way that leads it to EU. People have this understanding and have this feeling of clarity, very structural understanding and a commitment that there is a political angle of our transformation that is equally important. We actually had a number of consultations with our people and a public discussion, and it was a very clear message from my president that we have only 1 target: European integration and the victory, which are indivisible. And I think that this is the major driver. And that's why it's really important that when we're having negotiations with Venice Commission or with member states, I just had it over from Stockholm, it is a dialogue, it is a consultations, and it is a joint planning. But what we do is we do for ourselves and for our people, first and foremost.
Can you speak a little bit about what it's like to try to undertake the massive reforms required to join the EU while fighting an active war? I mean, how are the processes compatible, and are they sometimes incompatible?
Well, that's a very interesting thing, because it's like a snowfall, So you have 100% of commitments. You have 100 fully operational institution. You have full coordination and full green light for doing everything. And once you start, it's just like accumulating one starts after another. So when we were starting with all our anti-corruption and rule of law efforts, it was just relatively like a small number of things we plan to do is to appoint the heads of all the anti-corruption institutions, to start the judicial institution running. But now we see that this is a huge full-scale process which has been started around the country with, unfortunately, a lot of arrests, but also this is a clear signal that nobody is immune, so nothing could be done behind the closed door. And every time I feel very surprised in the morning with this or that detention, I feel happy in parallel, because it's not something that I would be happy to see over the media, but this is definitely something that gives a signal that nobody is immune, so that somebody who's still not disclosed will be disclosed. So it's really important to go learning by doing, and that's the religion we have just chosen, doing and doing and doing and starting. And we have also managed to pass around 100 bills in the parliament over this year only related to UFS. And we were not questioning whether this is, something that we have to do. We have to do it because it brings us closer to EU market. It would enable our companies to be more capable and competitive, and it would lessen then the amount of macro-financial assistance needed to be mobilized, because we will be able to survive. So 100 of bills, reforms and commitment is just like a snowfall, and we're really happy that it has started with granting Ukraine candidate status. Not because there were like 7 conditions, but we were in the war. The last thing we were thinking about, the leftovers of the reform, we were thinking of survival. But then on 23rd of June, all 27 leaders said, regardless the length of war, we will stand with you as long as it is needed. And when the war is over, when Ukraine wins, you will become member of EU. And we said, okay, let's do it together. And we started it all within the country.
Thank you so much. Ms. Mathernová, how does that look from Brussels? 100 bills. I'm sure there have been hundreds of volumes of papers and assessments of all of Ukraine's laws and policies. Where are you seeing the most progress, and where are you seeing some hiccups, And how do you assess the progress given all that Ukraine is facing now?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's great to be back at Globsec, and great to be on stage again. We've done many of these, Olga and I, and great to be with Michal as well. Before I answer your question, just one point, and Olga referred to it, but for me, the war is captured in 3 words that we are looking at. One is resilience. I don't think that needs a lot of explanation. The resilience Ukrainians have shown, the agency Ukrainians have shown, and reform. And I think that the third one is, all 3 surprised everybody. Ukraine was the largest unknown European country. Everybody thought it's just like Russia, they just speak a funny dialect, was the image. A lot of the population in Europe, a lot of policymakers even fell for the, very well spread Russian narrative. They're so corrupt, they're practically a failed state. And they have shown through resilience and agency and reform that they're not a failed state. The one thing that works in Ukraine is the government, it's the civil society, it's government at different levels, including the local level, the armed forces, etc. So Ukraine was not starting from zero during the war, but even me, and I've followed Ukraine very closely for the last 8-9 years. Even I have been surprised by the dynamism and the mobilization for the reforms during the war, that you actually fight a war and carry out reforms. Ukraine is a candidate member for EU membership together with Moldova. The 7 steps are to be able to make next progress in the negotiations, not a condition of the candidate status that's granted. And there has been progress on all 7, and they are quite demanding. Judiciary, anti-corruption institutions, track record on anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, national minorities, media, de-oligarchization. It spans quite a big spectrum. And what I find particularly dynamic is the judicial reforms. You are essentially now in the 3rd phase of judicial reforms, with the appointment of self-governing bodies, and once the Constitutional Court conditions will be met, the reform of the judiciary will have been really successfully achieved. And the anti-corruption institutions that have been set up since Maidan, since 2014, started to work. We all read in the media 2 weeks ago about busting the head of the Supreme Court. This is not a low-level official. This is the head of the Supreme Court. So that shows that the institutions work and that they are independent of the political power. And so there is a lot of dynamism. There are still areas where, and we can perhaps get to that later, where one will need to continue achieving some progress on anti-money laundering, very technical aspects. But I think the progress has been quite surprising.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Šimečka, there are often, very persistent fears in Europe, especially from a few key countries, about enlargement, and especially, Ukraine is a very large country compared to a lot of member states. How popular is EU accession for Ukraine in Slovakia, and, what do you see potential accession of Ukraine bringing to your country, to the V4 region?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation, and it's really an honor to be on this panel. It is not completely easy, the politics of advocating Ukraine's accession within a reasonable time frame. I mean, you just saw it in a few weeks back, the issue with Ukrainian grain. So nobody's saying it is going to be easy, even in Slovakia, although I'm pretty sure that Slovakia would benefit immensely from Ukraine's accession to the EU, from Ukraine being part of the single market, especially the eastern part of the country. I mean, Slovakia is a country with deep-seated regional disparities when it comes to economic and social development, and the eastern part of the country in many ways is still struggling. And Ukraine, its western neighbor, joining the single market and the European Union would be an immense boost to economic activity, to cross-border trade, and what have you. And a good analogy, perhaps, is the Austrian region close between Vienna and Bratislava, which also got a boost from Slovakia's accession to the European Union. So I think from Slovakia's perspective, it's absolutely in our vital interest that Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union as soon as it meets the condition and as soon as is possible. And although the politics is difficult at the European level, for instance, I mean, I remember 2 weeks after the war, on March 11, I was in Lviv meeting your colleague, Madam Sviridenko, and at that time, talking about candidate status for Ukraine also seemed like a long shot, especially in the Council and in Brussels, and it seemed like it's very, very difficult to achieve. At the same time, when you were in Ukraine and observing that, it seems like the most evident thing to do and the most obvious choice for the European Union to take. But the politics seem insurmountable, and we had that just a few months later. So even though today it seems difficult, because people would argue that because of cohesion policy of the EU, or because of agricultural policy, or because of the lack of institutional reform in the European Union, having Ukraine as a member soon would run into obstacles. I would say it's the same with the candidate status. It all seems impossible unless it's real. So I'm for Slovakia and also for the EU, I'm hoping that we can get there quite soon. And I also think that it would be good for not just, of course, for Ukraine, but for the European Union as well. I think what everybody's now saying that Russia's aggression in Ukraine has been a wake-up call to the EU, and that the Ukrainians' resilience and fight for their own freedom is teaching Europe of how important these values are, and that we actually shouldn't take them for granted. So why wouldn't we want that spirit, that resilience, that liberal strength, as part of the European Union? So I think it would be also good for us.
Thank you very much. Just keeping on this topic, I wanted to ask you, Minister Stefanishyna, what do you see as the biggest obstacles in Ukraine's EU path that actually don't depend on Ukraine?
Well, I think it's this general tendency of watering the agenda, while there is always many of the things in Brussels are always on a plate. While you have to speak about mobilizing only about Ukraine, you have to speak about mobilizing another financial framework structuring the reconstruction, putting and preparing new packages of sanctions, putting more pressure to Russia, speaking about the seized assets, the responsibility, and also talking about Ukraine's accession to EU and broader enlargement policy. So there's always many things on a plate. And not even talking about the defense industry and the new era of EU policies in this area. But I think that this is the most threatening issue, just to put everything in one basket. We really need to stay focused. And I would say, I'm really grateful to Swedish presidency in EU. They started this discourse about internal transformation in EU, reconsidering various policies. France has made a historical shift about transforming from negative connotation of enlargement policy to shifting it to a major discourse. So this has not been possible before Ukraine just submitted the accession letter. This was a taboo. No answers were to any question when there was an enlargement in a sentence, and now see what a variety of options we have. So this is the transformative power of Ukraine. We should get used to that. This is the first thing. And the second thing, I just want to probably put it this way. Even over this GlobSec discussion, there's nearly in every panel, in every discussion, there is an issue about Ukraine. Whether it's economy, whether it's resilience, whether it's crises, whether it's enlargement, future security guarantees. It is important, but it's not important only for Ukrainians that we are high on the agenda. It's important to understand that first we need to win the war. First we need to set up a just peace and bring Russia to justice. First, we need to answer the questions which bring stability and prosperity to Ukraine. And all of the issues should go next. And it's not because we are Ukrainians thinking this way. It is obvious, and it's really transformed into this discussion we have over these days. Because you cannot speak about like climate policy, or gender policy or anything like that without addressing major issue. You cannot discuss economic development or transformation without ending the war, without making sure that Ukraine are provided with security guarantees, without the clarity in terms of enlargement. So all of these issues are on the plate, but there are some which are priority ones. I'm sure that we will go through these transformations of EU. We will reconsider all the policies, but we should also stick to the understanding that first we should be clear about obvious. It is not possible to evolve without Ukraine on board, at least politically. It's not possible to consider the new policies without Ukraine and Ukraine being part of it. So let's go learning by doing, right? But not watching, not thinking, learning by doing. And I would probably end with a very small message of hope on our side that we will, looking back to all the decisions which were taken for Ukraine and for European Union, not to target Russia, not looking back on the shoulder, what they would say, all of these decisions were successful. And now you see Ukraine sitting here and represented here at this platform, a country which has been withstanding, remained fully operational, fully capable, candidate to EU, speaking about membership to NATO, and being a standard of NATO itself. So if there's anything you can do for Ukraine, just do it. We will not let you down.
Very good pitch. How does that feel from your perspective? What are the timeline of the next steps, and what can we expect now from this coming summer assessment by the Commission about the progress and the outstanding challenges?
Thanks a lot. And again, let me also answer a little bit the question that Olga was just answering, because I think that the obstacles to EU enlargement that are not in the hands of Ukraine are actually not negligible. And one is spoken about a lot. It's not only the policies that need to be revisited, a common agricultural policy, structural funds, etc., but it's the core of the machine, the decision-making process, which is not infinitely expandable. There are 27 members now. It's already difficult with 27. When one discusses enlargement of Ukraine, of course, the question of Western Balkans comes in, and suddenly you have 10 countries in the enlargement row. If you were to go to 37, you could not decide anything. So this is not a negligible issue to discuss. How the decision making, is every country going to have one commissioner? There is a number of small and bigger issues. So that's one, and it's talked about a lot. But the one that's not as much discussed, which is sort of an unspoken fear, and again, it's not negligible, is the potential shift in the balance of power. I mean, when the 2004 enlargement and 2007 and 13 of us came into the EU, we adapted. The power remains firmly where it always was. With the accession of Ukraine, it would inevitably shift further to the east, and that's something that is not easy to get accustomed to, because power is a zero-sum game. If somebody gains, somebody loses. So I think that's really important, and I tell that to my Ukrainian friends, that they need to realize that yes, there is a lot that they can do, but there are also these fears and legitimate worries that one needs to understand and cater to and address. And now to your question, there's going to be spring, I think it's going to be beginning of the summer update at the end of June, oral update on the 7 steps, as Olga mentioned. And all is going to be together with Moldova and Georgia as well. And then the regular enlargement package, and the 3 countries are the first time part of the enlargement package, will come out in October of this year. And then any potential discussions or decisions would then follow in December at the European Council. So that's sort of the timeline, and the message that we are giving our friends in the 3 countries is, try to fulfill the steps, not 100%, but 120%, so one can really make a very strong case for moving further on the enlargement steps, and also because the reforms that are required are actually good for the country. I mean, we are now observing in Ukraine a moment of really unprecedented unity and mobilization in the country that's brought together by the war. But those of us who have loved and dealt with Ukraine for many years before the war know that, just as everywhere else, internal divisions, internal fights inevitably will follow. So one needs to actually harness the unity of the war for the reforms that may be difficult to carry out shortly after.
Just a brief follow-up on that. Several weeks ago, I think it was, Timofey Milovanov from the Kyiv School of Economics did a long Twitter thread about...
He likes those.
He does, and we like reading them. But he did one very specifically that was about sort of the mismatch and the difficulty of, expecting Ukraine as a recipient of aid projects and aid money that come with a lot of strings and a lot of reporting requirements that, that are really difficult to fulfill in a war. Is there wiggle room for the type of reporting and auditing and I don't know when you look at this disbursement of the funds, on the understanding that this is wartime, or is the standard even stricter? And I don't know if you have something to say about that as well. Sorry, we'll come back to you in a moment.
I mean, the really very, very large sums of money are expected to come after the war for the reconstruction, but it's true that already now there is very sizable outlays. I mean, the US is a big donor. The EU together have put 68 billion euros since the beginning of the war, and that excludes, apart from the European Peace Facility, the military expenditures. The Commission is on a monthly basis disbursing a package of 18 billion euros of this year for macro-financial assistance. So there are systems in place already. whether with the Ministry of Finance or with the road and the agency, the colleagues that repair the energy infrastructure, etc. But obviously these will have to be made more robust for the post-war, for the reconstruction amounts. I don't think it's so much about reporting as really looking at efficient use of the monies. I mean, I was just talking the other day with someone that there is a lot of discussion of accountability, which is extremely important, and I think there are many agencies that are already setting up systems. There is a lot of activism in the civil society in Ukraine itself. There is a lot of donors that are coming up with accountability mechanisms. What I'm missing a little bit is a discussion on how to equip Ukraine to be able to carry out the reconstruction, because the preparation, planning, procurement, implementation of projects is as important as the monitoring. So I'm not so worried about the accountability framework. That's going to be robust, hopefully well suited, but I think that we also need to help Ukrainians to be able to prepare the mass of projects that will be needed to transform and reconstruct the country.
Probably just a small comment. I'm not the financial guy, let's say, more about reforms and politics. But efficiency, what Katarína says, is key, because it's about real enforcement and implementation. And if we are talking about set of things to be done after the war, they should be done fast, targeted, and very effective. But what you're saying about the financial support, it's about the balance. It's always about political balance. The more trust you have in the country, in reforms, in our commitment, the more transparency and understanding, then less conditions you have. The less you have trust and understanding, the more conditions you have. So that's how it is working in the financial negotiations. Our Minister of Finances does the great job in terms of onboarding the money, and we do the discussion on the reforms, aligning that and the conditions in that regard. And that's why when we're talking about this resolve towards reforms and transformation, first and foremost, we focus on the rule of law and anti-corruption. This is essential for us. So this is essential for us, that the institutions are there, people are nominated, they are functioning, and they're showing the result. The whole world should see and understand that it is operational, that it is functioning, because this gets the understanding that the country is running, and those, like, we're getting rid of this old Soviet and Russian narratives of the failed state, as Katarína was saying, because, it's very awful when I come to some of the countries a bit more distance from Ukraine, and I hear that they still have this understanding of my country of back in 2013 of Yanukovych time. And I just want to scream and shout and say that you do not know anything about us. So I mean, what we're working on right now is bringing higher this leverage of trust, understanding, and transparency to make sure that we can onboard finances fast, but also gain trust for that.
I want to ask you, Mr. Šimečka, then, how are the levels of trust being felt in the debates that you're having with your colleagues in the European Parliament? And just in tandem with that, how is this tension that Ms. Mathernová brought up about the eastward shift of power? What kind of debates are you having about that, and what kind of solutions do you see for those assuaging those fears?
Katarína is right about the various obstacles facing Ukraine's accession to the EU, obstacles that have nothing to do, or almost nothing to do, with Ukraine itself, what it does or what it doesn't do, that have to do with the EU and the way EU functions, and the way power is distributed in the European Union, the way money is distributed in the European Union. There's one more that I would perhaps add, and that's unfortunate, and it's a product of the past 10 years, and that's the experience with the breakdown in rule of law and democracy standards in some of the new member states. And this has been a very big problem for generating trust in enlargement in general, but it's set back also the Balkan countries, and because lots of my colleagues in the European Parliament, but also in member states, would say, well, looking at what's happening in Hungary, well, why would we want more of this in the European Union? So that trust issue is crucial here, and it's unfortunate that it's part of the debates on Ukraine as well, and it will be when and once it becomes real. So just to add to those difficulties, they are there. But I think today, I mean, the amount of trust that Ukraine has earned is immense, not just because of the kind of reforms in rule of law in other areas is doing, but precisely because it shows Europe the kind of ethos that well, everybody suddenly realizes that we need, that Europe is perhaps become complacent about the kinds of values that we hold dear and what they cost, and it has become complacent in geopolitical terms. And so in that kind of larger sense, I think there is a way in which Ukraine's story of the past year or so will transform Europe. And in that sense, regardless of the process and of the conditions and all of that will take place. But I think this is a much bigger moment for Europe or the European Union of who we are. And I think Ukraine joining could be and should be a defining moment. And of course, it will upset the power balance, and of course, it will cost us, or perhaps it would require some reforms of the agricultural policy and of structural funds and all that. But what I would really argue that we shouldn't do is look at the obstacles and say it was too difficult. I think, and this is my fear, that lots of times you hear we shouldn't raise expectations too high for the Ukrainians. We shouldn't be talking about a swift process. We shouldn't be talking about timetables and dates, because we create expectations that are simply too high, and there will be frustration on the part of the Ukrainians because of the obstacles that are there. What I would say that the expectations are already there, because Ukraine has fought and died for our values, and everybody sees that. And well, if you can't lower expectations, there's only one way to, you have to meet them. And I think that's now for the European Union to realize. And as we've seen with the candidate status, I think it is possible.
Well, we have a question from Slido. It's a perfect time to transition to questions from the audience. Should Ukraine be allowed to take shortcuts through the process of joining the EU?
Or maybe I should start answering it just to cut this, tension from the European Parliament and the Commission. So we never asked for once, first and foremost. We've been talking about the fast-track accession and anything related to that, but we never asked for shortcuts. So when we are talking about the fast track, we're talking about first and foremost about ourselves, that we are capable of acting fast, delivering fast, and let's say not skipping sort of stages of the formal process, but making it really fast. So we're now waiting, for example, for the formal accession to start. We have already started the self-screening process. By the moment this decision will be taken, hopefully relatively soon, Ukraine will complete the self-screening process, which means that we would not need another 4 years for this process, which has been usually taking place with the other countries. We will have things done on a plate. We will suggest it to Commission, and it hopefully will not take too long for assessing that. And we are already part of EU single market. So just from the night from 23rd to 24th of February, when the full-scale war started, we have made a decision, and I'm really proud of this decision. We've been discussing with that was our Minister of Energy just in the evening, in the morning on 23rd, whether we should start this, launching this isolation mode to make sure that our electricity is operating without access cut off from Russia and Belarus if there's a war, and we decided to do it. So we thought, okay, there might be a war, but then we will start doing it anyway. We did it, and now we are part of the EU electricity market. We're top 20 importers to the EU. We already enjoy tariff liberalization and customs liberalization. So it's not that tough. We are already there, unless, like, in case somebody haven't noticed that. So when we're talking about the fast track, we're talking about ourselves first and foremost.
Thank you. Ms. Mathernová, we have a question from Charles Tannock in the audience about to what extent Ukrainian accession is tied with the accession of Moldova. Will they join together, and how can either of them join if any of part of their territories remain occupied by Russia or its proxies? Cyprus's partial occupation of Turkey, by Turkey, excuse me, still remains a major challenge. And is that something, that's going to be repeatable for Ukraine, or is that something we've not in the cards?
I would like to separate two things. To start negotiations, and I very much agree with Olga. There should not be shortcuts, but one can go through the process a lot faster than we have seen so far. So I very much agree with what she said, but one has to distinguish starting the process and finishing the process and joining the EU. There's no question that there's no appetite in the EU to let countries in that don't control their own borders. I mean, I think that's clear to the Ukrainians, that's clear to the Moldovans, and that's clear to the EU. But that doesn't mean that the process cannot go on and that the various steps that go in between cannot be fulfilled. But it's very clear that Ukraine will have to be, and Moldova as well, in charge of their borders in order to eventually join the EU. But that's still, even if the process is very much accelerated, it's very different to NATO, where it's about political will. Here, there are technical aspects that take some time, but the time can be much shorter than some fear. But at the end, the countries have to be in charge of their territory and control their borders. That's very clear. And I think that Moldova going along with Ukraine would be good for both. I think that's currently the mode, or the mood rather, sorry, in Kiev, both in Kiev and Chisinau. Perhaps felt a little more sensitively in Chisinau than in Kiev, because it's a small country, big country dynamics a little bit, but I think there is no question about the determination in both of the capitals about the direction of the countries.
Thank you. I saw we have a question from the audience here. If we can get a microphone, possibly. Right here. Hope it's a good question.
Eugene Choli, president of NGO Ukraine 2050. Madam Deputy Prime Minister, the president of Ukraine has very delicately qualified as a miscalculation the Franco-German decision 15 years ago not to allow Ukraine into NATO. Do you see today a shift in that observation and decision-making where NATO member leaders see Ukraine's accession to NATO as the best security for their own protection in the future?
Thank you. Again, thank you for everything you've been doing. Although I do not respond to your messages, I see them all, and your communication is really very, very active over every day of the war. I don't want to be really over positive, but I would say that there is a shift which has already been taking place domestically in such countries like France, and what is more important when we're talking about NATO in Germany. For example, as a deputy prime minister for NATO, like just 3 years ago, I literally had nobody to meet in Berlin to discuss my Euro-Atlantic part of a mandate. I'm really frank on that. Now the situation is different, absolutely, but we are not happy with that, because the time for this shift was then, back in 2008, in Bucharest, when Ukraine were not granted at least the membership action plan to join NATO. That's what we were asking for. And we can discuss, many things, but the time was then, back in 2008, which means that by the moment we're here, we would not be in a full-scale war, we would not be in a war of 2014, and we would probably not be in a war which has been started from Georgia back in 2008. And it is also confirmed by the decision for Finland and Sweden, which would definitely for Sweden will be taken as well, like 2,000 plus meters of borders with Russian Federation cost basically zero reaction, a part of the Twitter furiosity. So it just confirms that this decision should have been taken further. But I think that the positive thing that I can identify in that regard is that now the issue related to Ukraine in NATO is the all-German issue. So it's not only about the decision of the chancellor itself, like it was for basically a couple of decades before. It's all German issue. And there is a feeling, and I think that this is a particular positive input of Chancellor Scholz, that there is an understanding that it is all German decisions. The parliament is engaged, various parties are engaged, the government has been discussed this issue with, and that's something which brings us to inevitability. But I think that again we're coming back to the slogan "learning by doing." It's only by doing that we can really make sure that talking and shifting is true, and the Vilnius summit will be the decisive point to us. We have been already dozens of times in a situation where ahead of every meeting of the NATO leaders, we're starting from the scratch. You cannot imagine how many thousands of times all of us have heard that it's not the right time, we do not want to irritate Russia. We have heard this narrative has not changed. Without war, with the occupation, with the full-scale war, with the inability to participate in a NATO summit because we are simply being bombed and unable to come there physically. So Vilnius summit would just give the answer to the question if something will change. And political invitation of Ukraine to join NATO is absolutely essential over this meeting. All the modalities, all the decisions could be discussed further, but the process should be started now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Šimečka, we have been discussing, at least, I also cover Russia, and it's very apparent that President Putin is playing a waiting game. He thinks that he can just wait it out, that the political forces will change, that people will get tired of the war, of the expense that a lot of Western countries backing Ukraine are spending. And we have a question from Slido here from Rick Zednik, asking very directly about Slovakia. Rick asks, a majority of Slovaks now view Ukrainian refugees negatively. What would you do? How will you influence Slovak political leaders to change this? And how do you, keep the support and maintain support in general across Europe as this goes on longer and longer?
Indeed, the figures, and Globsec released the polls just a couple of days ago, they are terrifying, really bad. Also on the question of who caused the war and who's responsible. And really, especially in comparison to other member states or other neighbors, it's really difficult. It makes for a difficult reading. We'll have elections in Slovakia in 4 months' time, and that's going to be the pivotal moment. And the concern that if the elections go the wrong way, that there might be a U-turn on foreign policy, on support for Ukraine, and that whereas today Viktor Orbán is more or less isolated, that suddenly he can have a partner in the European Union on Russia policy, on support of Ukraine, on Ukraine's accession. That is a real concern. But there are still 4 months of electioneering and campaigning to do. So I still think, despite the numbers and despite the figures and despite the studies, I still think that the experience of accommodating Ukrainian refugees or helping them, of living with many of them, and provided that there's a government which supports Ukraine, but also takes care of the Slovak economy, of the concerns of voters, and of what is needed to be done. I think I'm absolutely sure that those numbers and that levels of support can be can increase. It's not set in stone. A lot depends on what kinds of people are in power and speak about these issues, and that's what elections are for. So I don't think it's doomed. I think it's a lot rides on how the election turns out.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we will have to end on this note, but a very good note to end on. Please don't leave. We will continue the next panel right after a short video with an interesting topic, the metaverse. Is it a safe space? Thank you, and come right back here. And thanks to the panelists.